Good morning and welcome to Veterans Heartbeat on the Pulse of the Veteran, where we discuss issues of health, happiness, opportunity, and well-being of interest to the veteran community, their families, and the community who honors them.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of Veterans Heartbeat, brought to you by River, the Rural Institute for Veterans Education and Research. My name is Jason Zencraft. My co-host Ed Lasofsky is here with me, and he is the Executive Director of River. We welcome you to a weekly wide-ranging discussion of issues, events, opportunities, and needs in our veteran community. Morning, Ed. How you doing?
Morning, Jason.
We'd also like to thank our sponsor, Farside Signs. They create amazing-looking vehicle graphics that will drive traffic to your business. They are located at 1526 South Avenue West in Missoula. Follow them on the web, Instagram, and Facebook, or just stop on by.
This morning, we're going to be talking to Tom Rao, who has a Ptsd in neuroscience, who's with Virtual Minds here in Missoula. So, good morning, Tom. Can you give us a little of your background, where you're training in neurosciences and all that?
Sure. I got my undergrad in cell and molecular biology here at the University of Montana, and then I went on and did a clinical lab rotation, and that was at University of North Dakota, and then I came back here and did graduate school in neuroscience at U of M for acute neural injury. And so I did a postdoc with Dave Polson. We were working on developing kind of new drugs for the treatment of traumatic brain injury and stroke. And then after that, I basically stayed on and became an assistant research professor at UM.
And now you've got your own company, one of which is Virtual Mind, right?
Yes, that is correct. The M-Ready project, which was the Montana Research and Economic Development Initiative, actually gave us a grant to develop new methods for diagnosis of traumatic brain injury. And one of the things to come out of that was the Virtual Mind technology, and we spun a company out of that into using virtual reality for diagnosis of TBI.
Now, it's kind of a funny story how you became involved with River. Do you want to explain that one?
Yeah, we were actually taking cabinets, lab cabinets, out of a space that had never been used. It was designed for cancer research, and it had never been used. So we were in there cutting the cabinets out to get them over to Montech, and you came over and you were like, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" So it was a kind of a serendipity meeting for sure. And then you kind of talked about what you were doing, and that's kind of where we connected. But yeah, I was definitely on the ground with a cutting wheel, cutting out pipes when we met.
You know, fate has a funny way of showing its head.
That's true. I definitely didn't look like a scientist. I was more like someone stealing pipe. We weren't stealing pipe.
Well, moving forward with everything that we're doing here, we recently signed an agreement with you to bring your technology over to the Institute. And if you could give us a little background of what that equipment will do.
Yeah, that's great. So one of the problems that has been encountered with TBI diagnosis is consistency. And so some of the current tests that are available right now, the impact test and some of the other neuropsych evals, a lot of times they're missing individuals. They're misdiagnosing them. They're not giving a very realistic view of how the brain is functioning. And so what we wanted to do was take tests that we had kind of developed at U of M through study and put them into a virtual reality environment, and where we could control what the individual sees, we can control what they hear, and that gives us an enormous amount of flexibility to assess cognitive function. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was put individuals under cognitive load, almost like a cardiac, a stress test. So when we test them, we're pushing them pretty hard with some of these tests to figure out how well they perform what we found is individuals that are suffering from long-term effects of traumatic brain injury, and this is athletes and military individuals exposed to blast. Their performance drops off very quickly when compared to individuals that don't have a TBI. And so a big part of what we're doing is taking that virtual environment, manipulating that in such a way where we can actually assess multiple parameters of cognitive and neuromotor function without them even knowing it. And what we're finding is individuals that have these long-term effects from brain injury, their response times, their cognitive processing, and their endurance, their cognitive endurance is much, much lower than individuals that have never had head injury. And so it's very exciting for us to get this technology over to River, as part of our private company, to work with River and assess veterans that have had either head injuries or PTSD and figure out, what areas of the brain are being affected and what's the best method for treating that.
Well, as you know, we've been doing the vestibular testing, and that was kind of one of the things that we started out with you and 5 other individuals. Can you explain to our audience what a vestibular disorder is?
Yeah, in a very basic sense, it has to do with the inner ear system and balance and how you orientate your body in space. And what they have found is individuals with vestibular disorders, that's actually a very good way to look at TBI recovery, is how well that vestibular system is. And obviously it's very, very sensitive. How well they perform in this vestibular testing gives you an idea of how the brain damage is repairing, what their recovery rates are. And so it's just another method and measure to get a very overall output view of how the individual is progressing after their head injury. And vestibular disorders have been tied to a lot of different neurological issues. It's very, very prominent in individuals that have had a TBI, and so it's a great way to look at how well they're progressing after that injury.
Now, to get a vestibular disorder, you don't necessarily have to have a bomb blast or any of the other traditional TBI issues.
Right. Yeah, there are, since that system is so sensitive, it is possible to have, different environmental conditions that can cause one of those disorders. So, yeah, it's not just limited to traumatic brain injury. There are other things that can occur that can cause those vestibular issues.
Now, we've been talking about this quite a bit on the show. Can you explain to our listeners, I mean, you're the expert on the brain. We're not. We're just trying to figure this out for the vets. Can you explain the crossover in symptoms between TBI, PTSD, and vestibular disorders?
Right. Well, I mean, that starts to get a little bit tricky because there is a lot of overlap between PTSD and TBI symptoms. Obviously there's depression, there's hyperarousal, there's difficulty in concentrating. There is a lot of overlap, and vestibular disorders, there's a lot of overlap in those as well. A big part of trying to tease that apart and say, well, yeah, you have PTSD, but you don't have TBI, or you have a vestibular disorder that was caused by TBI, that's something that's very, very hard to do. Sometimes it's complex. But part of what we're trying to do with the testing that we do is, look at different areas of cognition and neuromotor function and determine which individuals, have PTSD symptoms but are different from TBI. And that's difficult to do because TBI is such a heterogeneous disorder. There are people that have more frontal lobe damage than, say, parietal lobe damage, and that will manifest itself in a different way with regards to their cognitive performance and their emotional state. So it's very, very hard to do. What we found when we looked at veterans, a lot of them that have that have been diagnosed as PTSD also have a traumatic brain injury. And so there's evidence that individuals that are exposed to TBI are much more susceptible to the development of PTSD. And so, those three kind of areas really interact quite a bit. So as of yet, we haven't been able to tease them apart completely, but that's something that we're working towards.
Well, that's been one of my issues with the VA, and I don't pick on them very often, but I am going to pick on them on this show. They are not testing for vestibular and TBI. Somebody has the symptomology of PTSD, they immediately send them over to mental health. And I think that's doing a disservice to our veterans.
Well, right. There's plenty of evidence that TBI causes changes in brain function, and it's not unrealistic to say individuals that are suffering from PTSD may be organic in nature. So there may be structural changes in the brain that are occurring that are giving rise to that PTSD or exacerbating it. And same thing with the vestibular disorders is that, whenever your brain is an exquisitely sensitive organ, and so when anything has been disrupted, you're not going to be functioning the same way you were before. And so you can imagine where you put someone into a very stressful situation, they're exposed to a blast, or they fall and they hit their head, and then they're exposed to a stressful situation or something, emotionally traumatic. They're not going to be able to deal with that as well as they could if they hadn't had a head injury. And so we feel, that there's certainly organic nature. There's brain damage that occurs that's exacerbating those PTSD symptoms.
Well, one thing that we run into a lot at the Institute is we'll have veterans come in who have been diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury. So years down the road, they'll go to seek treatment, and the doctor orders an MRI. The MRI comes back negative for TBI. Can you explain how that MRI may be false?
Right. So that's one of the problems with diagnosis of mild and moderate TBI is there are no gross structural changes in the brain that occur. What they're finding and what we found in our animal research and what they're finding in humans is that there's no neuroimaging sensitive enough to pick up the structural changes in the brain that are occurring. So you imagine you've got trillions of neurons in your brain. They're all connected like the roots of a tree, and that connectivity is what gives you your mental function, your capability. So if you have an injury and those really super ultrafine roots are being damaged and they pull back and those connections are lost, you're not going to function the same way. But we don't have the capability currently to visualize those things. Well, we just don't.
We do, but it's an electron microscope and the...
Yeah, right. You can with an electron microscope, but the only problem is you have to take their brain out to get to it. But currently, I should say with inhuman imaging, we don't have that capability, and that's been a big problem for a long time. It's a lot of you can get an X-ray of a bone and say, yeah, that bone's been broken. You can't get an X-ray of their brain and say, yeah, their brain has been broken. And so that coupled with the fact that everyone seems to recover differently from head injury, that leads a lot of people to say, well, Bob, he was exposed to a blast and he's totally fine. What's wrong with you? And why can we do an MRI and we see nothing wrong with you? And then they instantly think, well, this has to be psychological. It's not structural in nature. It's not actual physical damage to the structures of the brain. But what we've seen in animal research is that's not the case. Is that in very mild injury in the animal produces profound changes in the brain that can only be detected through microscopic analysis.
Well, that leaves us to the issue of these veterans that are completing suicide in Montana. And what we're seeing at the Institute is these high-tech diagnostic processes like the vestibular that we've been doing. By the way, you got to view that the other day. What was your thought on it?
Oh no, I think it's excellent. I mean, what you guys are doing, I think, is what it needs to be done, and that is we need better output measures, and that doesn't involve neuroimaging because neuroimaging is not sensitive enough. So we really have to find advanced measures of how they're functioning. Those output measures, so things like vestibular, balance, eye tracking, cognitive performance, to put together a profile on the individual, looking at these different measurements and say, okay, yeah, your vestibular performance is fine, but your cognitive performance is off, your balance performance is off, and that helps. I think that's going to help. That's the future of TBI diagnosis, is figuring out how to pinpoint what areas are deficient. And then we can start to treat those things, because up until now, without having good output measures of what's damaged, you don't really know where to start treating.
Now, one issue that we've ran into in dealing with the VA is they say that the vestibular disorder issue is experimental. Can you comment on that?
I understand where they're coming from, because the vestibular disorder is still, it's still being researched. There's still work being done on it. That doesn't mean that it's not correct. And so I think that, there's research that's been done on it that's scientifically valid that can be used to support the argument that there are vestibular disorders and they do occur, and that, they produce impairments. So I think that, saying that it's still experimental, I think that's kind of a way to disregard some of that research, which isn't really valid.
We've got a short amount of time with you, Doc. Real quick, if there's a veteran out there that has issues that he feels might be PTSD, but doesn't want to come in, and that's where we have the greatest suicide area, testing for the vestibular and the TBI. And by the way, we're bringing your equipment into the Institute, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Coming in and testing for that does not mean that they're going to go for a diagnosis of PTSD at the end. So that's not what you do. That's not what we do. We're trying to help the vets. Am I correct on that?
Yeah. And the information that we provide on the virtual reality, on that cognitive and neuromotor testing, we're not making a diagnosis. We're simply providing the clinician with objective information on how the individual performs and how that performance compares with other groups of individuals that have never had a TBI, or that have had a TBI and recovered, or that have had a TBI and have not recovered. And so, we're looking to provide scientific information for clinicians that they can utilize to then design treatment plans or monitor that patient over time and say, look, this individual's improving or they're getting worse. That's really what we want to do is help bring objective measures to that TBI diagnosis.
Well, I sure appreciate your time this morning.
You bet.
It's exciting to work with you, Tom. I mean, you're also a veteran yourself. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah. I was in the Air Force. No combat. I was a crew chief on 141s. But that was 91. I went in. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Oh yeah, you bet. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate what you're doing, and have a great day.
Thank you.
You too, Doc.
Well, Jason, that was pretty exciting to have Tom on this morning, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was great talking with him. He's a great guy, speaks very well, brilliant individual, and we're just happy to be able to work with him over at River and bring his technology that him and the guys at Virtual Minds bring to the table when it comes to TBIs.
Well, the other thing that we talked a lot about this morning was diagnostics. At the end of the month, in November, our two medical directors, Dr. Ibsen and Dr. Chaco, yourself, me, and Fez are headed to Arizona to take training from Dr. Gordon on treatment. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are heading down, and Dr. Mark Gordon, if you're unfamiliar with him, we've talked about him a few times on the show in the past, and he's even been a guest on our show before. Again, another brilliant individual. He focuses on neuroendocrinology. So how he got into that field is he was a family practitioner who decided to look into traumatic brain injuries. So he started looking at just individuals, civilians with traumatic brain injuries, then started diving into the NFL, became kind of a hot point there, and he did a lot of research with them. And then he started working with the military. But along the way, he noticed that out of all these individuals who had traumatic brain injury, mild and severe, all of them had severely decreased hormone levels in 11 or 13 different hormones. So he started diving a little deeper and finding out that damage to the brain, go figure, the brain controls everything. It also controls your endocrine system, pituitary gland in there controls all the hormone levels in your body. So when you have low, for example, we'll just say low testosterone, especially in a male, is going to cause an increase in anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, all these different issues that can contribute to suicide, which is our main focus over at River. So he started diving into that area, which got us really intrigued. So we looked into his seminars, and he has this seminar coming up at the beginning of November. So we decided, hey, let's get the docs together. Let's head down and see what he has to offer. And hopefully we'll be able to bring his protocol to our clinic.
Well, the other exciting thing is the alpha stems that we talked about are in the clinic, and we will be training up and offering a free clinic here pretty quick. Can you explain that?
Well, absolutely. October 27th and 28th, we're going to be hosting clinics. The 27th, which is a Friday, will be here in Missoula. The 28th will be over there in Polson at our Polson branch. So we'll be offering comp and pen counseling, crisis intervention if need be, and then definitely the main focus is going to be these alpha stim units, which we've been talking about at length, and we're going to be trying to bring some pain relief without the use of pharmaceuticals.
Also, during those clinics, there will be some acupuncture given, and our docs are available on telehealth to speak with some of the vets if they need to. A lot of exciting things. So, Jason, what have we been doing for Halloween so far for the vets and their families?
Well, this last Wednesday, we had pumpkin carving for any veteran and their family who wants to come in, no kid too young, bring the whole family, and we have carving pumpkins. If any of the parents are worried about their kids having sharp objects, we also have painting. They can paint the pumpkin. We have a ton of them. We got little hay bales and everything. So it should be a lot of fun. Food and drinks. So it was a lot of fun to see all the families out there carving up pumpkins and just being together.
Now today, for our recreational event, which we have been doing every week, what are we doing today?
So here shortly, we're going to be heading to Blue Mountain to do some falfing. If you're unfamiliar with falfing, it's Frisbee golf. That's why they kind of mesh the two words together. It's a lot of fun. Even if you're really not big into Frisbee, I'm not personally, but I absolutely love falf. It's the idea of golf where you get out there, try to make it in the basket with a net in it in the fewest number of throws possible. So we're going to be bringing a bunch of families, veterans and their families out, and try to have a blast today.
One of the things that I'd like to start doing here on Veterans Heartbeat, and I'd like veterans out there to call us up at the Institute, and I'd like to start sponsoring a veteran every week, telling their story, letting people know what they were doing when they were in the service. So if any veterans out there want to talk about their service, we really would like to hear from you. Finally, I'm not going to mention names, but I am going to say that we've been hearing from the VA a lot on getting in for care. This is a request to the VA to start stepping up to the plate. We're getting so many veterans that are calling in that are not getting return phone calls when they're trying to enroll for care. I'm using the microphone for this time only, begging the VA to start returning these veterans' calls. I've got a veteran right now with back pain that's been trying for 2.5 months, and we've emailed, called, and no response. So my request to our listeners is start phoning Senator Daines, Senator Tester, and Congressman Giaforte. Let them know that this is an important issue.
Absolutely. That's the one thing that we hear the most is access to care. Unfortunately, there's just not enough employees at the VA to address the demands of so many of the veterans that live in our state. We have the highest per capita veterans in the whole United States. So the more help we can get, the better. The easier the access, the better. Just the more things we can do for our veterans, the better. So hopefully we'll be able to make a change just to bring everything back around. We really do appreciate Dr. Rue for coming on our show, talking about the amazing things they're doing at Virtual Mind and how it's going to be integrated into the River clinics and how we're going to start doing these outreaches to the Polson area, eventually out towards eastern Montana once we solidify it, and try to give these services to veterans and bridge that gap that unfortunately the VA doesn't have enough employees to cover. So thank you very much for listening to Veterans Heartbeat. We'd not be able to bring it to you without all the support of the listeners. And thank you again to Farside Signs for sponsoring the show. If you do need a unique vehicle design, swing on by and check them out. Also, thank you to our main sponsor, River. River has an array of services such as veterans-focused education, a vestibular disorder clinic, and now non-pharmaceutical treatments for pain, anxiety, and depression. Check them out on Facebook or on the web at riverofchange.org. Lastly, we'd like to show our appreciation to all of our veterans. Thank you for serving our country and keeping it safe.